Okay, guys, so how we end up calculating this for nitrogen is basically converting this into a decimal, which is 0.786, and you multiply it by the total atmospheric pressure, which is 760. And then essentially you get somewhere about 597 millimeters of mercury. And so essentially this is what you see. So you see 159 for oxygen, 597 for nitrogen approximately, because at sea level there's about 78% of nitrogen mixed into the air we breathe, about 20% oxygen. Carbon dioxide in water is smaller. For water or carbon dioxide, there's something around 0.04%, which when we give partial pressure ends up being 3.7 millimeters of mercury. And then water vapor is about 0.46. So you just calculate all of these by essentially taking the 0.786 or the percentage here, right? And then multiplying it by the ATMs. And essentially this is equal to also the pressure that you find in the alveoli as well. So Henry's law just says basically for gas mixtures in contact with liquid that each gas will dissolve in the liquid in proportion to its partial pressure. And so the amount of each gas that will dissolve will depend on two things. It'll depend on its solubility. Just to let you know, carbon dioxide is 20 times more soluble in water than oxygen is, right? And very little nitrogen will dissolve at all. So this just tells you a little bit of difference in solubility. And the other thing that determines whether it will dissolve, right? Or, is temperature. So as temperature of a liquid increases, basically solubility decreases. So a perfect example of Henry's law is when you think about the hyperbaric chamber. And so how this works, right, is that here, essentially we have an increase of pressure. And this is, hyperbaric chamber is equivalent to actually going and diving in the water. So here, it's the idea that as you increase pressure in the lungs, so you have an increase of it going into the blood. So it's likely, just remember, this is the idea that gas will dissolve in the liquid and it's proportional to its pressure, right? So as pressure ends up increasing, essentially, right, the fact of the matter is the oxygen increases its ability to basically dissolve in the blood. So when we're talking about homeostatic imbalances with this, breathing O2 gas at 2 atm is not a problem for a short period of time. However, oxygen toxicity develops rapidly when the partial pressure is greater than 2.5 or 3 atm. The problem is that you have so much oxygen there that it starts generating a lot of what are called free radicals, and these are destructive oxygen species. So essentially, they'll go in and they'll just start destroying all the different types of proteins there. It's one of the theories or hypothetical theories in the idea of what could be aging. And so this results in things like central nervous system disturbances, coma, and even death. So being at 1 atm is perfect. We don't have a problem. This would be going down to a certain level or depth. And diving, this is kind of the idea when people start using things like different, what's it called? I'm trying to think. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's kind of late right now. When you go diving, and it's a slightly different mixture of oxygen that you can do. Anyway. And so it's a concern. So when we're talking about alveolar gas, alveoli actually contain more carbon dioxide and water vapor than atmospheric pressure does. And it's basically because of the fact that we have, to begin with, gas exchange. And so in the lungs, O2 is basically diffusing out of the lungs, right? And it's going to the body. But at the same time, you're essentially getting CO2 going into the lungs. So that's one of the reasons why you end up having more CO2 in this location in the lungs, say out in regular, just the atmosphere, because of the fact this is diffusing out of the body. Now, there's more things like water vapor because you're getting humidification of the air. And this is by conducting passages. And so essentially, with this, we do have liquid kind of going over these alveolar areas. So you're getting essentially that moisture developing. And the last of this is we are getting a mixing of alveolar gas with each breath. And so you have this newly inspired air mixing with air that was left in the passageway already. So then you're going to get this increase in things like water vapor and CO2. So a little bit different in composition of gases, close to where you're having that gas exchange happen. Now, let's actually talk about external respiration. So external respiration or pulmonary gas exchange involves the exchange of O2 and CO2 across respiratory membranes. The exchange is influenced by partial pressure gradients and gas solubility. So essentially percentages of gas that we see there and how readily they can dissolve. Thickness and surface of the respiratory membrane does help to influence that exchange, and ventilation perfusion coupling or matching of alveolar ventilation with pulmonary blood perfusion is essentially important. So, when we're talking about all of this, let's kind of start first. Let me see what's here. When we're talking about the partial pressure gradients in gas solubility, right, there is a steep partial pressure gradient for oxygen that exists between the blood and the lungs, right? For the blood, it's about 40 millimeters per mercury. Pressure in the lungs, it's 104. So essentially this drives, so let me see here, on here. Since the since there's a gradient that is essentially where the lung, like I said, is at 104, and the blood is at 40, this drives oxygen into the actual blood, right? And it reaches equilibrium in about 25 seconds. But takes red blood cells about 0.75 seconds to travel from the start to the end of the pulmonary capillaries. Even if blood flow speeds up 3 times that, it still can keep up, right? So the carbon dioxide pressure is not as high, but more soluble, so it diffuses at equal rates, right? So O2 equilibrium, just to reiterate, reached in about 25 seconds, but it takes red blood cells, essentially about 0.75 seconds to travel all the way through the capillaries. So it ends up keeping the exit of CO2 and the entry of O2 about equal because of this. So here with thickness and surface of the respiratory membrane, the respiratory membrane is really thin and it has a large surface area. So essentially, because of we have such a large total surface area of the alveoli, it's about 40 times the surface area of the skin. So it's able to really help with that exchange rate. And the last is this ventilation perfusion coupling, right? And so what I mean by that is if you're looking at perfusion, this is basically the blood flow that reaches the alveoli, right? This is controlled by the arterioles diameter. Ventilation is essentially the amount of gas that's reaching the alveoli. This is controlled by bronchial diameter. So essentially we're talking about blood, right, reaching the alveoli where oxygen's going to basically be picked up. And here we're talking about the lungs, right? And oxygen going from outside to inside to the lungs. And so essentially what we're talking about here is that we want the perfusion rate and the ventilation rate to be about equal, right? For it to be optimal and efficient gas exchange. So we want that blood to come and pick up the oxygen, and we want the oxygen to be there to diffuse at an equal rate so that we have that good, perfect balance. So balancing ventilation and perfusion, essentially, if you change the diameter of the local arterioles and the bronchioles, that can essentially synchronize ventilation and perfusion, right? Ventilation and perfusion is never balanced for all alveoli because you do have regional variations. So that can affect gravity on blood and airflow, and occasionally alveolar ducts can get plugged from mucus, causing unventilated areas. But essentially what we're always trying for is to have that perfect balance between the two. So if we have some kind of coupling that's off, for instance, if you have less air or oxygen coming to the area than you have blood coming through the area, right? There's a mismatch of ventilation and perfusion. That's decrease in ventilation, which is a decrease of oxygen coming into the blood, and an increase in basically, let's go O2 coming, an increase in blood carrying, right? Then what happens in the local area, because blood is able to get to the oxygen really well, you're going to have more carbon dioxide and less oxygen in those two. So O2 levels can be regulated, and that's going to be through the arterial diameters. So from here, pulmonary arterioles serving these alveoli are going to constrict. So when they constrict, that's going to reduce perfusion, and it'll be able to match basically the amount of ventilation that's happening, right? Now, if we have ventilation that's greater than perfusion, basically what happens is we have more O2 coming to the lungs and less blood coming to pick it up, right? So that's an increase in ventilation and a decrease in diffusion. So that's going to cause a reduction in the amount of partial pressure for carbon dioxide because it's going to be less there, right? Because not as much blood is coming back. And it's going to be increase in the partial pressure of oxygen because there's a lot of it there. So the O2 autoregulates the arterial diameter, and in this case, the alveoli essentially will dilate, right? And I mean, the pulmonary arteries that are there will dilate, allowing more basically will dilate, and this will allow the perfusion and ventilation to end up balancing out, because then essentially, because you have ventilation greater, you want more blood to be there, right? More blood. So you're going to get dilation to happen. And that's going to increase the perfusion rate. So that's how they work together to try to keep them in balance. Sorry for that. And so now let's talk about internal respiration. And so this is when we have capillary gases exchanging at the body tissue. So the partial pressure of O2 in the tissue is always lower than in the arterial blood for PO2. Essentially what happens is when that happens, right? So in here, essentially oxygen moves from the blood to the tissue, right? So that's why it's always lower in the arterial blood. It's always, the tissue is lower for oxygen than the arteries themselves. And so, because remember, just like in diffusion, you go from high to low. So because the arteries have more oxygen than the tissue, that's going to essentially help mediate oxygen to move from the blood to the tissue. The partial pressure of CO2 is always higher than arterial blood CO2, right? Because essentially in the tissue, we're doing cellular respiration. And in that, if you remember, one of the byproducts is carbon dioxide. It happens in the intermediate step when we're looking at the breakdown of pyruvate. And we also have it in the Krebs cycle. So we're making a lot of CO2 there. And so CO2 is going to basically move from the tissue to the blood, because then again, it's going from, in the tissue, it's high, right? In the blood, it's low. So it's going from tissue to blood. How basically oxygen is transported, it's called molecular oxygen, is carried in two ways. About a small amount of it is dissolved in the plasma, but most of it is bound to iron and hemoglobin in red blood cells. And hemoglobin can carry a total of 4 oxygens. And so when we look at oxygen being transported, essentially each hemoglobin molecule is composed of 4 polypeptide chains, each with an iron-containing heme group. So each hemoglobin can transport about 4 oxygen molecules. Oxyhemoglobin is the form when it's actually combined together and carrying oxygen. Reduced hemoglobin, or deoxyhemoglobin, is when it's actually reduced or released the O2. And so basically it goes back and forth, right, between being, this is separate, so this essentially happens in the lungs, and so in the lungs it goes from being separate to being bound. And then in tissues, it goes being bound and it separates, and then we end up using this for cellular metabolism, and then this goes back through the circulatory system. So loading and unloading of oxygen is facilitated by a change in the actual shape of hemoglobin. As O2 binds, hemoglobin changes shape, and it helps to increase its affinity for oxygen, right? As O2 is released, hemoglobin shape changes, decreasing its affinity for oxygen. So if something is fully saturated or 100%, how many heme groups essentially are carrying how many heme groups? Basically 4. There are 4 heme groups, so all 4 heme groups will be essentially bound to oxygen. Partially saturated, which means there are only how many heme groups carrying oxygen if it's a partially saturated? It's either 1 through 3, right? So not all of them are full. So oxygen transport, or basically factors that influence hemoglobin saturation. And so this is the rate of loading and unloading of oxygen is regulated to ensure that there's adequate oxygen levels to cells. Factors that can actually influence this are essentially temperature, and so you have heat production, and active tissue can directly and indirectly decrease hemoglobin affinity. Let's put increased temp. 2, you have blood pH. And so here, if you actually go through like acidosis, which if you remember from last semester, acidosis is a decrease in pH, making it acidic, right? This is going to increase the partial pressure of CO2, causing hemoglobin to oxygen affinity or bond to weaken. The partial pressure of oxygen can influence how much or so concentration of oxygen there, and the concentration of what's known as PBG. And so this thing is produced by red blood cells during glycolysis. And so essentially when BPG, which just stands for 2,3-bisphosphate glyceric acid, which is just a byproduct during glycolysis. When these PBG levels actually rise, essentially that's what happens when O2 levels are low. And then essentially it decreases the binding affinity of oxygen to hemoglobin. And this guy also can do several things. For instance, he can increase heat, decrease pH, and essentially decrease oxygen for ATP production. So these are the four factors that can influence hemoglobin saturation, or how many oxygens can actually bind onto hemoglobin. Now, CO2, besides just oxygen, CO2 is actually transported as well. 7 to 10% is dissolved in plasma as carbon dioxide. 20% of the carbon dioxide is actually bound to globin part of the hemoglobin, and it's referred to as carbaminohemoglobin. 70% of it is transported as a bicarbonate ion in plasma. And as you remember, you might remember that carbon dioxide and water will create carbonic acid. And then that essentially can be used as kind of this buffering system in our body later if you or the bicarbonate can. But this can, if you do not get rid of oxygen, carbonic acid can essentially increase the pH of the blood. And let's watch this video really quick.
Whether you're racing in a triathlon or doing something less strenuous, you need to breathe in oxygen to help you get energy. And breathe out carbon dioxide, a waste product. When you inhale, your diaphragm and rib muscles contract, increasing the volume of your lungs. When you exhale, these muscles relax, decreasing the volume of the lungs. When the lungs expand, air pressure in the lungs drops, causing air to flow into the lungs. When lung volume decreases, air pressure increases, causing air to flow out of the lungs. Air enters the nose or mouth, moves down the trachea, and goes into the two bronchi. Air moves down smaller and smaller bronchioles until it reaches a tiny sac, an alveolus. Each alveolus is surrounded by capillaries. Oxygen diffuses from the alveolus to the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood to the alveolus. As blood flows through the capillary, it becomes rich in oxygen. In the blood, oxygen diffuses into a red blood cell and binds to hemoglobin, a protein made up of 4 subunits. One oxygen molecule can bind to each subunit. Oxygen-rich blood flows from the lungs to the heart. Which pumps this blood to capillaries all over the body. Here, we see oxygen diffusing from a capillary's red blood cells into a muscle cell. Oxygen is used by the cell's mitochondria to produce ATP during cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is released. How does carbon dioxide leave the body? Carbon dioxide diffuses from cells into capillaries. Some carbon dioxide stays in the plasma, the liquid part of the blood. Most carbon dioxide, however, enters red blood cells. Some carbon dioxide binds to hemoglobin. The rest is converted to bicarbonate, which diffuses into the plasma. This oxygen-poor blood flows back to the heart, which pumps it to the lungs. There, carbon dioxide diffuses from the plasma into the alveolus. Bicarbonate enters red blood cells and is converted back to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is also released from hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the red blood cells, into the plasma, and into the alveolus. When you exhale, air flows out of your lungs. And that's how you release carbon dioxide, get oxygen, and keep on running.
So essentially you can see here that here is the tissue, here's the interstitial fluid, and this is the blood. So essentially in this first one, you can see that oxygen is released from, essentially you are seeing it here in the form of the hemoglobin attaching to the oxygen and then severing that attachment and then releasing out into the cells or the tissue itself. And then you pick up carbon dioxide here, and then that guy can essentially bind with the hemoglobin that no longer is attached to the oxygen, making this carbon-amino hemoglobin here, and then that essentially can transport the oxygen or carbon dioxide out of the tissue. If you see here in the lungs, then essentially you see this carbon dioxide, or what happens is you have this combination of hemoglobin and carbon dioxide together, and it splits to allow the carbon dioxide to leave, and then the hemoglobin can take up the oxygen. So it's just kind of this exchange system that happens. And then, of course, you see some of it is just there in the plasma to begin with for carbon dioxide. But for the most part, and of course here if you see that, you have some carbon dioxide that is combining with the water to make carbonic acid, and then you have some oxygen that's dissolved in the plasma, but overwhelming majority of them is in the red blood cell. So CO2 does have influence on blood pH. Carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system helps blood resist changes in pH. The changes in respiratory rates and depth affect blood pH. So slow, shallow breathing causes an increase in CO2 in the blood, resulting in a drop of the actual pH, which is called acidosis. Rapid deep breathing causes a decrease in carbon dioxide in the blood, resulting in a rise in pH, which is called alkalosis. Changes in ventilation can help adjust pH when disturbances are caused by metabolic factors. So breathing plays a major role in acid-base balance when we're talking about metabolic factors. So if your pH is changing due to metabolism, then essentially it's going to make you breathe faster or slower. So just the smallest thing, which for instance, I'll talk a lot about working out and exercising. And essentially, when you start breathing faster when you're working out, it's not due to the reduction in the amount of oxygen into your body, but it's the increased amount of carbon dioxide there. So essentially, you're breathing faster to essentially balance the pH in your blood by getting rid of carbon dioxide. Now, there are neural mechanisms that control essentially respiratory centers, and they are the nerves in the reticular formation of the medulla and the pons, right? And so the medullary respiratory centers are a cluster of nerves in two areas in the medulla that are most important. The ventral respiratory group, or the VRG, they are important. In rhythm generation, and integrative center. And so they're responsible. You'll see them. They extend out of the spinal cord to the pons and the medullary junction, but they set what's known as eupnea, which is essentially your normal respiratory rate and rhythm. So the average is somewhere between 12 to 15 breaths per minute. So they control, so come over here. They essentially help with inspiratory nerve excitation by exciting muscles, right? In the inspiratory muscles. So they do it by basically exciting the pharynx, which is responsible for activating the diaphragm and the intercostal nerve. And the intercostal nerves, if you remember, were those ones that didn't belong to any plexus or anything. And they're responsible for the external intercostal muscles. Now, the dorsal respiratory group is a network of nerves located near the root of cranial nerve 9. They integrate input from peripheral stretch and chemoreceptors. And they send information to the ventral respiratory group. There's not a lot known about this group of neurons. And just let you know, there's not a lot really understood about the origin of the breathing rate. One hypothesis is that they are what are known as pacemaker neurons. And they believe that these guys can be found in the ventral respiratory group that can kind of control this intrinsic rhythm. But they're not totally sure. And so there's a load of factors that basically help influence breathing rates and depths, right? You have chemical factors. So you can think these are important factors that affect depth and rate of respiration. So you can think of things like, oh, I hate when I do that. Sorry, guys. Like pH, right? There are central chemoreceptors that are located throughout the brainstem. There are peripheral chemoreceptors found in the aortic arch and the carotid arteries. And essentially what they can do is they can look at changing levels of O2 or CO2, mostly CO2, right? And if blood CO2 rises, and that is known as hypercapnia, CO2 can accumulate in brains and joins joins with water and becomes carbonic acid, right? And so this can help essentially is a way that we regulate the pH, but there are chemical factors that can essentially affect respiratory centers. The influence of higher brain centers, you do have the hypothalamus. That actually, through the limbic system, can moderate rate and depth of respiration, right? So think, you can essentially have breath holding that occurs in anger or gasping with pain, right? So that can happen here. When angry or in pain. You can have change in body temperature can change the rate, right? And so that affects whenever you're thinking about the hypothalamus. You also have cortical controls. So this is the first one, right? But then you also have cortical controls. And so this is the cerebral motor cortex that can bypass the medullary and this is the whenever we are voluntarily holding our breath, right? And we can hold on to it until the brainstem basically reinsteps breathing when CO2 levels get too high. So that's the other way that we can do cortical controls. Pulmonary irritant reflex. And so there are areas or there are receptors and the bronchioles that respond to irritants like dust or mucus or noxious fumes, right? So basically, they communicate with the vagus nerve. And it can promote reflective constriction of passages. And sometimes they can also promote like coughing. Okay. And the last one is this inflation reflection or the Harry-Burn reflex. And this is essentially stretch receptors in the pleural membrane. And so when the lung gets inflated, they send information or inhibitory info to the medullary respiratory center. To end inhalation. And so this is basically a protective pathway. And so this basically just goes over everything I just talked about. So, here, for instance, when we were talking about the stretching in the pleural, you can see here, stretch receptors in the lung will go into the respiratory centers in the medulla, right? And that can essentially, has a negative effect, or irritants will go into the medullary area and that has a negative effect. So all of these in these respiratory centers is going to essentially stop breathing or inspiration, right? And then you can look at here a decrease in oxygen, increase in carbon dioxide, or the positive protons. Essentially, this is going to cause an increase because we're trying to really get rid of the carbon dioxide. Or the central chemoreceptors, this is the peripheral receptors. You can see that are in this kind of the peripheral, which is in the aortic arch and the carotid artery, where the central here is in the brainstem. But when they do this, both of these are going to increase inhalation, right? And then receptors in the muscle and joints essentially can detect these changes and increase whenever you get more like CO2 happening here. Other receptors, pain and emotional stimuli, can do either add or subtract the response, and they do it through the hypothalamus, right? So any of those, and then the hypothalamus will communicate to these respiratory centers, right? And then, of course, you just have higher brain functions that go for voluntary. So if you're trying to actually hold your breath on purpose for any reason, that's going to come from the cerebral cortex. It's just whenever the changes happen, like here in the blood system, for instance, like this increase in CO2, this peripheral chemoreceptors, if you hold your breath on purpose, that'll happen for a while, but then this will kick in. And so the last thing I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to come back with the last video, and essentially it is going to go over all the different homeostatic balances that we see for the respiratory system, and that will be the end